Well, usually the poverty step is a stepping stone to homelessness. That they fall into poverty first and then fall into homelessness after. But some of the ways are really simple, as you might expect. The economic downturn means that if people are unemployed and they don't have enough coming in to cover their living expenses, that they'll eventually end up losing wherever they're living and end up homeless that way. Some of the more unusual ways that people might not always think of are mental illness and addiction, that they too will result in people becoming homeless because they either spend their money foolishly and support their addiction with it instead of taking care of necessary living expenses, or their addiction gets in the way of maintaining employment and they lose their job. And so once they've lost that income, then they end up becoming homeless afterwards. Probably the only other thing that might be related to that is people who are severely mentally ill, perhaps abusive, perhaps addicted, or sometimes addicted from their homes by their families, where they're separated from those that their loved ones and that they live with and become homeless that way as well. Their major challenges are the matters of basic necessity, what is the bottom tier of the Maslow hierarchy of needs. So they need to get food, they need to get shelter, they need to get clothing. The other thing that if they can get assistance on those basics, and that's not always terribly easy to get assistance on those basics. Government assistance in those areas is pretty limited. And charities, particularly in a time of economic downturn when they have their greatest need, there's also the least amount of charitable giving that takes place when people don't have lots of extra money. So that it's a terrible spiral for the charities. But even if they can get some assistance that way, frequently what they suffer from is a lack of feeling like they belong anywhere or have any kind of self-worth as well. That society pretty much tells them that if they're homeless, they're useless, that they're fundamentally human trash. And so they're treated that way, and that starts to rub off on them as well. The food programs probably are the most in abundance. People are most used to the food drives and food collections. Clothing is probably the next easiest after that. It's hardest to find shelter. Can do lots of different things to help. When there are drives by reputable charities that are seeking money, like Salvation Army at Christmas time with their bucket campaigns, Milwaukee Rescue Mission does a lot of direct solicitations. Those are some of the big providers in our area. There are some local charities as well. Cooperating Churches of Sussex run some assistance programs. Being able to help out as much as you can, as often as you can, is a good thing. And small amounts are just as valuable to them as large amounts. Generally, they've got good connections to turn small amounts of money into large amounts of assistance. And they pool all those small donations together, so that works out nicely. I try and put on my Christmas list for my family every fall that before Christmas what I would ask them to do is something for me as my gift, is every time they pass a Salvation Army collection bucket, they put something in. Even if all they're doing is dropping in a quarter every time they go by. All these little quarters add up, and it becomes big assistance. So that's one thing. You donate money if you can. Otherwise, take a look at what it is that you're discarding. So old clothing can go to clothing ministries and outreach places. Old bedding and mattresses and those sorts of things sometimes can be taken in by shelters. Even as babies and infants outgrow and no longer need things like strollers and baby carriers and stuff like that, there are places that will be able to put them to good use with people in poverty as well. So those are all good things to do. Direct service would be the one that requires the greatest commitment on somebody's part, to go and help out at a shelter, help out in a meal program. Mm-hmm. I think there's sort of a mix. Sometimes I think people's bad choices force them into poverty. Other times they are forced into poverty by circumstances they can't control. Forced into it where if your spouse can't work, or you don't have a spouse and your job just disappears, that you might find yourself there pretty fast. Most people don't save very much either. A high percentage of Americans are only one paycheck away from being homeless, that they live paycheck to paycheck. And so even losing a single paycheck might mean defaulting on rent for a month. And particularly if you're a renter, they're not very forgiving. It takes longer to get evicted if you're paying a mortgage. It's a very short turnaround to get evicted from an apartment if you don't pay rent. So sometimes as short as 3 days between when your rent was due and when you might find yourself out of your apartment. So sometimes it's circumstances beyond people's control. But for those people with mental illness issues, and particularly for those with addiction issues, it's sort of chain reaction. They make bad choices, particularly about their addiction. Their addiction costs them their job. Their addiction costs them their family. Their addiction costs them their home. But it was ultimately the bad choice that led to it. I don't know of too many people who I think anybody would describe as lazy enough not to ever even seek employment and therefore just wait to be evicted from one place and then move on to the next. Only one person who described himself as being homeless by choice, and I don't believe him. I believe he's a Vietnam vet, and given the rest of his behavior, I think he's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. But he claims to want to be homeless by choice because he doesn't want to be beholden to anybody. He doesn't want to owe anyone for rent. He doesn't want to owe anyone for a mortgage. He doesn't want to have to worry about possessions. And so he claims he lives free as a bird in that way. But I really think he'd rather be reunited with his family. And it's his alcoholism and his abusiveness that actually separates him from them. No. And what we do is sometimes misdirected. So there are assistance programs in a limited fashion that are provided by the government. They're not very large, and they certainly don't meet our need. But they are, the one thing the government does do well is they make them easy to find. Just like you can get emergency assistance by dialing 911, or you can find Digger's hotline easily by dialing 811. If you call 211, that's a referral service that the state runs for all kinds of social needs and can get you counseling if you have an addiction. It can help with mortgage assistance. They can help with homeless and shelter assistance. So 211 is a good way to be able to find programs, but there aren't an awful lot of them around. Instead, what government spends a lot more money on is the criminal justice system, because politicians get elected by being tough on crime. They don't get elected by being kind-hearted and funneling taxpayer dollars into shelters. And so frequently what happens is the fines and the punishments for any kind of citation increase as politicians are running. So if you're a homeless person who gets ticketed for panhandling or loitering, even if you're in a public place, you can get cited for staying there for too long, for loitering there. If you have nothing, you're not going to pay the ticket, and then 30 days later that'll become a bench warrant. And what the judge will give you the next time you get picked up might be anywhere from a 5 to 10 day jail stay. For the same amount of money that's being spent on prisons and jails, you could put that same person in an assistance shelter for a month and then find them a job and help them get out of their addictions and increase their education, all for that same amount of money as being spent on 10 days in jail. And so ultimately it would help society greatly if we shifted our money away from jails and into other kinds of assistance. But there are small things that are being done. The need just outstrips it. The need is really great. That's one of the hardest ones. The legacy of the United States of America is that the American dream says anybody can become rich and successful by being an innovator and finding new jobs and opportunities. It's just a lot harder now than it used to be. And most of them require an education in order to be able to do them. So our newest millionaires and billionaires are all people who work in the technology field. They certainly didn't get there without an education. And so doing well in school is probably the easiest way to get out of a life in poverty. Being willing to work hard and being willing to accept a starting position because you see that it leads to something else are other ways that people can get out. And then there are assistance programs that try and overcome the barriers that are in place for race and for gender and for geographic dislocation, where there aren't any jobs in the area where somebody lives and they can't travel. Things like that happen. So there are some assistance ways to get out as well. It's just not as easy as it used to be. I have spent a lot of time with a lot of people who have shared their lives. I've been with them on the streets on occasion. One time as part of a training program to get ready for working with homeless people, I spent a couple of days without shelter on the streets in Milwaukee. And it's a difficult life. It's not just challenging to figure out where you can be without getting arrested or harassed by police officers. And it's not just a matter of trying to figure out where the meal programs are, or where the shelters are, those sorts of things. There's a lot of legitimate violence that happens. It's a very dangerous lifestyle to live in. And if you're a woman on the streets, your odds of being raped are really very, very high. Even if you're not raped, your odds of being attacked by somebody who is suffering from the effects of their addiction or from severe mental illness are also really, really high. People who just are desperate and so act desperately because they have nothing and they have nothing to lose, and so they can risk the little that they have. And so they'll take risks like mugging somebody for their coat or for their shoes or those sorts of things. It's a dangerous lifestyle to be in. It's not nearly as idyllic as saying you get to spend most of the day in the sun and then if you find a shelter you get an evening meal and away you go. You have to worry about all your stuff being stolen while you're asleep, or someone, as happened to an acquaintance of mine who lives on the streets. He was attacked by another guy who was severely mentally ill and hallucinating. And the hallucinating man saw my friend and thought he was somebody else, and so clubbed him in the head with a brick. And he ended up spending 3 months at Frederick Hospital and losing an eye. So, he was just sound asleep, not harming anybody in the world when he got attacked. So it's a very dangerous lifestyle. In Wisconsin, we have other particular concerns for homeless people. Like when it gets to be wintertime here, we know that there's severe weather that happens. It gets really, really cold, and we have nights where we have 60 and 80 below wind chills that go out there. If you're out all day in the wind, then the wind chill seems to bite even worse. And one of the things, just as a matter of personal comfort, that affects a lot of people is if they get really wind chapped and their skin starts to crack, that hurts. And lotion is something that people frequently panhandle for. They'll say they're asking for bus fare or things like that. But if you happen to be outside and there are some eye-opening things that you can experience that way. I work with some people who go to look for folks who might be left behind. If you're homeless, you're not going to hear a weather warning that says it's going to be 80 below with a wind chill tonight. You're not going to have a television to see that on. You won't be buying a newspaper if you had the money. You won't be listening to the radio because you don't have one. And so you won't know that weather's coming. So there are people who go out when that weather approaches and they search through the homeless community and all the sites that we know people hang out in to try and get them into shelters. And special emergency shelters are opened up. But you have to find them before something bad happens to them. And so the worst thing I've ever encountered was finding a person who had died because of that exposure. And not only was it tragic because he had died, but it was shocking because after his death, his body froze to the ground. It was literally frozen to the sidewalk where he was. And when the medical examiner came to try and recover his body and take care of it, they ended up having to do things like heat the sidewalk all around it so that the sidewalk would let go and release and be able to take him in. And that's just not something you ever anticipate encountering.